Hello, and welcome to the presentation today called A Holistic Guide to Change Management. Let's figure out together what was really needed to make change management successful. My name is Julie Moore, and I'm the president of Mind the IT Gap. Change management is a very important process for many organizations. It's one of the key building blocks of fundamental things that we have to do as an organization to make a difference in the way that we provide services to the business. It is the place where we can innovate and bring into the environment a lot of very positive things that will help to promote the usage of services by the business. But there's also the things that we have to do within change management that are reactive to things that are occurring in the live environment today that may not be functioning the way that they should. So we have changes that are produced that are both proactive as part of the innovation and the service lifecycle of creating new services and making modifications to existing ones. And then we have the reactive side that's fundamentally driven by the operational environment, the need to fix things or improve stability within the live environment. Now we have to be able to do this, produce change in a controlled way to minimize our risk and the impact of any type of disruption to the business. So for us to do change management right, we have to balance the need to innovate, to create change with its potential impact on the environment. And this really requires a holistic approach to change management. Why can't we just all get along? I mean, if you look at service transition, we have all of these incredible things that are happening in order to make change successful. And change management is a life cycle process. It's happening at all times, but there's no time more important than when we're going through transition, that we're working with service asset and config, and we're working with continual service improvement and all the other processes within transition, so managing stakeholder commitments and change evaluation. This is a very important, critical part of what we do as a service organization in order to bring about change. And so we have to be able to coordinate our efforts with the broader service transition in order to make certain that not just the change can be successful, but our organization, the way that we support and deliver that service ongoing once it's in the live environment. So we have a tremendous amount of all these things kind of like plates up in the air spinning around that we have to keep in balance to make change successful. And it's important for us to understand that change is fundamentally where what we're trying to do occurs, but it really relies on many, many different processes to be successful. So my first key point here is to jump right in and change. Why do we have to have change management? And really it's because we have to establish a need for change. When we begin looking at the service lifecycle and we look at what happens and what goes wrong from an IT organization perspective, it's when changes are introduced into the environment that don't produce the results that were expected. They have unintended disruption to the business. And these are the types of things that drive the need for a more holistic approach to change management, where we're working with these other partners to ensure that what we're producing in the environment will be successful, won't have the unintended impact. So there is really a need for us to look at changes across a life cycle approach from when they're initiated all the way until they're implemented, and we review those. That's what we have to get better at doing as an organization. We also have to really begin to drive greater consistency into the IT organization. This means looking at what the business needs us to do, being able to maximize the value that we produce, minimize incidents, minimize disruption. And the part that really is the rub is when we have to redo things that we didn't do right in the first place. And this is definitely something that doesn't look good to the business from an IT perspective. It doesn't look like we truly understand what we're doing. So we have to get better, more consistent at the way that we view the change and the way that we work together to ensure success of that change. Now, the business and IT produce a lot of these requests for change in order to keep the services that we have in the environment today aligned with what the business needs them to do. So we have to be able to effectively respond to those demands for change. If we don't, the business isn't going to be able to turn on the dime and innovate the way that they need to drive innovation within their industry and with their customers. So it's important for us to be responsive, but be responsive in a way where we can produce quality outcomes. So IT must ensure that we have this life cycle approach where we record our changes, evaluate, authorize, prioritize, plan, test, implement, document, review in a controlled manner. And that's driving the need for change management. And, you know, when we think about what does change management produce for an organization, the ability to react quicker, to better manage the mergers or acquisitions or transfers of service, higher success rate for changes, better being able to predict what we'll get from a change, from a service level perspective, driving greater confidence that we have the controls in place for compliance with laws and regulations, better estimates of budgets and where we use our resources to produce change. And then, of course, if we do things right, we have better productivity of our IT staff and better productivity for the business, and ultimately, we will reduce risk. And who doesn't want more of that in their IT organization? So let's start with a green field. What will we include in change management? How will we actually govern the process? And one of the most important things for us to begin with is what is the scope of change management? And I know that there's a lot of things that we could put into change management, but what we have to do is to adopt a change management scope that works for our organization, begin to get some level of control in the environment, and then begin to expand what change management focuses on. Now, traditionally, what's in are all of our configuration items and our service assets, and then the changes that are coming from the strategic part of the organization, from the business, from tactical operations, or tactical, the way that we work across processes, across the service lifecycle, and then the operational environment where we're producing changes to maintain the environment and to optimize the services as they're already being delivered to the business. And what don't we typically include in change management? We don't get into the business, right? The business manages their changes. Now, if they're going through a major strategic initiative and it has an impact on a service, as soon as that impact we know and we need to innovate or make change, then it comes in scope. So we do have to manage the interface with the business so that we get awareness of these things, but we don't track what the business is doing within their strategy operations. So this is the picture that really represents what's traditionally in scope. We have the center, which represents the service provider. That's you. That's your IT organization managing changes that are coming from the business and from the tactical and operational environments. Now, we have strategic changes that are new services coming into place. We have tactical changes, which are usually significant changes to existing services, and then operational changes, which are the day-to-day operational things that are required to be modified to keep the services running. Now, the sources come from the service provider, but they also come from the business, and they also come from our suppliers that we use, maybe for break fix or managing the network. And each one of those realms, the business and the supplier, are also managing their change at the strategic, tactical, and operational levels. So when we begin to look at this and say, wow, that's a lot to take into scope, well, we can break this down by beginning with, let's start with our operational changes. You know, what is occurring in the environment now, today, that we have to do in order to support and deliver those services. Then begin to tackle the tactical changes where we begin to draw greater visibility in cross-functional changes and those types of changes that are going to better produce results for the business. Then we can go after the strategic changes, the things that are integrated with service portfolio and the changes to business strategy. We can also look at it by, let's start with our stuff. What can we document within the internal service provider? Then we can look at our key relationships with the external service provider, get all of that in working order so that we're beginning to capture and draw visibility into that relationship and the changes that go across that interface. Then that enables us to be much more successful in focusing in on the business, the changes that are being generated from the business relationship. Another very important part of establishing a change management process is really beginning to adopt common principles and policies across the organization. A principle is a general approach. It's a key concept that we can adopt within change management that will give us consistency. Everybody will view that principle the same way. It's a common way for us to begin working together using these same concepts. The policy is our intention. It's the way that we're going to use that principle or that concept in our environment. So these are going to be much more specific to a particular work environment. We generally want to document these and create consensus that, yes, we're going to use this principle, but this is what it means to us, and this is what we intend to do with this key principle. So when we think about these types of principles, policy is the first thing that comes into mind. Policy is something that if we can agree how change management will work in our environment, and we agree on that before we implement the process, then what we're going to do is kind of break down some of those barriers that exist within an organization that prevent us from being successful with change management. Now, there's a lot of policies that we could have in place. There are some that would give us really quick wins. If we can get our project team to agree that we have a zero tolerance for unauthorized changes, that we will prioritize our changes, that we will create accountability and responsibility to manage those changes throughout their life cycle, to create a single common focal point for all changes to go through, to prevent unauthorized staff from actually having physical access to the environments where our infrastructure is housed, enforcing that changes go through during these change windows, and of course measuring the process to make certain that it's aligned with what we need to be doing to generate value. Those are quick wins. If we can get our project team to say, yes, those are fundamentally the policies that we would like to drive in our organization, then we've got the construct to move forward. Long term, when we begin to expand what change management does into those different realms that we were looking at within the scope, then we can align change management with the business project and stakeholder change management processes, create business value through measuring the value of change management at the strategic level, integrate with other service management processes, and of course get much more formal in the way that we do risk evaluation of all of the changes in order to minimize impact. Now, the third key thing is to build a very solid foundation for change, and this is really important to be successful. The first thing is we have to agree, what is a change? If we can holistically across the organization define what a change is for our organization, that's the first step to go to moving forward. It's the first rung in the ladder. So typically a change is something where it's adding something to the environment, modifying it, removing it, but these are things that are deemed to be in scope for configuration. If it's not important enough for us to track the asset, it's probably not going to be as important for us to be monitoring the changes associated with it. So if it's in scope, then we need to be able to provide an appropriate documentation and lifecycle approach to managing that change to a configuration item. The second thing is, and this goes back to our core policies, is that we have to agree on our change types. Now, these are the three that come out of the ITIL framework, but this doesn't necessarily mean we have to agree that these are the three, but we do have to come up with an agreement of how we will kind of put all the changes that occur in our environment into types that allow us to take an effective response. Normal changes really are things that happen on a day-to-day basis. They're not necessarily things that we may have seen before, but they're the typical types of things that come out of a change environment. Emergency changes, these have to be done as soon as possible, and they typically can't wait till that change window. So we want to keep the emergency changes down to a minimum in order to minimize the risk. So we have normal and emergency. The other category is known as standard changes. These are changes that do happen more frequently in the environment, and we know about them, and we have an established way in which we handle those changes. So if a new change comes in, if we can agree normal, emergency, or standard, then what we'll be able to do is build from there how we can effectively manage that change. And it's important for us to create consensus on these types of changes. The next thing is to categorize these changes, to come up with an ability for our organization to understand what is the impact, what is the probability for risk associated with that change. Anytime we have a high level of risk, we have to apply more management to that risk. So part of what we do when that change comes in is we say, okay, what is the impact and what is the probability in order to assess the risk category of that change? That then will indicate to the organization exactly how that change has to be managed. So we have to agree, create consensus on how we will categorize those changes. It's a key activity that occurs within the process, but we have to develop the construct prior to going into developing the process on how these changes will be categorized. And of course, they're also prioritized. There are times where changes have to go in immediately. These are generally the emergency changes. And they have to go in because there's right now significant loss of productivity or revenue to the business. We cannot wait. High priority, these are generally where we're affecting a large number of users in the environment. They're driven by requirements that are outside of the organization, or they're supporting a business initiative. Then we have medium priority and low priority. And of course, if we can agree upon the names of the priorities and the types of changes that fall into that, then we can agree how we will respond as an organization to that level of priority. Another thing that we have to agree on prior to going into being able to manage changes is how will we authorize these? Who are the appropriate authorities within our organization based upon the types that we've agreed upon that can authorize a change to go in? If we're a really large organization, we're probably going to have multiple change management processes. Does everything have to come through a singular CAB meeting? Maybe not. Maybe we can have some local authorization, and these are typically around those things that fell into that type of change known as a standard change. We know about it. It happens all the time. It's well documented. Therefore, the risk can be minimized, and we can allow local authorization. But anytime we jump up in our risk, the categorization of risk, or we jump up in the urgency and we move out of those standard changes, we then fall into the realm of typically things that would have to go through a CAB or an ECAB. When we have changes that are going to impact a larger part of the organization or multiple services, we have to have a higher level of insight, probably a governance or some sort of IT management group. And then, of course, anything that's high cost, high risk, that has a significant potential for significant impact on the business, we would need to get the business level their executive decisions. So we have to decide, based upon the types that we came up with and the risk categories that we came up with, what is an appropriate structure for authorization of those changes once we go live with a process. Now, one thing that we just can't forget about when we start talking about change management is that there's more going on in an organization around change than just physically changing configuration items in the environment. When we go through implementing change management, we are essentially changing the way that the organization works. And if we don't take into account the people element of this, then we could very well be unsuccessful with a change management process. So we need to incorporate organizational change into any change that we go through, making certain that we get consensus, that people will follow the process, that it will be institutionalized so that the organization is following this repeatable pattern for success. So as you go through thinking about building the core building blocks of change management, you have to address organizational change to make this successful. Now, another key element here is to create a document trail. There is nothing more important in change management than really fully vetting out and understanding and documenting what occurs so that we can learn and get better as an organization of the way that we conduct change management. So there are things, change models, workflows, proposals, the change schedule. There's creating the request for change forms themselves, other documents, and don't forget, fully documented roles and responsibilities are very important. So let's start with the change models. The change model enables us to do those standard changes as quickly as possible without going through the CAB because they are documented. They have a predefined set of steps that take us through how to handle that with all kinds of checkpoints that help us to manage any type of risk. They're usually automated through a workflow within a system that we're using to manage those changes. They'll include the steps, roles and responsibilities, time frames, escalation procedures. That's real important. The more we can document here, the more likely we are to keep pace with the business, to innovate, and to drive change, because all of the repetitive stuff is being managed through workflow and through documentation. And that's a core part of what makes us successful with change management. The more that we can push down to this level of documentation, the more efficient that we'll be. Now, change proposals are real important because this is our opportunity to really understand what the business outcome is supposed to happen from driving a strategic change. It's our opportunity to get a high-level description of what the business wants to achieve, how it's integrated within the business processes, what it is that they're expecting to do, and it's our connection with the business that helps us understand what is it that the business needs from this change. It also has a business case that vets it out, that says, you know, here's the risk, here's what will happen if we don't do this change, here's the value that it will create, here's the cost. And if we vet it out, we're better able to make the decision on its priority and how we can integrate it into all the other changes that are occurring within the environment. We also need a schedule going through the design and the implementation of that, a proposed schedule for how that change will be managed within our infrastructure. So this is a very important document that helps as we go through transition and into the operational environment to understand the intent of strategic changes and to better make us aware of how we're going to serve the business's needs. Of course, there's all kinds of reports that we're going to need to produce that help us to manage the change management process. And we need to define these prior to going live. What is it that we want to measure that's going to show us how the value of this process is translating into value at the business level? So we'll have general work volume types of metrics around the number of changes based on category or priority, how many changes had a successful outcome that met the customer's requirements. But we also want to get into, you know, some of these structures that we put in place before around prioritization and risk in order to understand how successful change management is enabling us to manage that risk. So when we think about, you know, documentation, being able to come up with a structured approach that enables us to manage the process going forward, to understand the workflow, but also the value, will then enable us to continue with that organizational change. Look at the value that we're creating here with change management in our organization and translating that into the benefits that we see within the business realm. Now, as far as roles and responsibilities are concerned, here's where, again, we're getting back into organizational change. If I want people to commit to the policies, to, you know, the types of changes and the prioritization and categorization of changes, I need to help them to be successful. And that means coming up with clear roles and responsibilities around what people are going to be doing, what's expected of them within change management. And that means a RACI model. Looking at each of the activities within change management and saying, okay, who's responsible for doing and executing the work? Who's accountable for the outcome of this task? Who are we going to talk to and consult with as we're going through this activity? And who is going to be interested in the outcome of that task? Now, these are important for us to document, not just for you know, the change manager or the people that might be on the CAB or the ECAB. These are the people that are going to be managing those changes, you know, building or testing or implementing those changes. They need to understand how their roles and responsibilities can impact the success of change management. And when that becomes more clearly defined, and we set and manage those expectations, we begin to see the culture change where we adopt a more holistic approach to change management and we get success and can translate that success into value. So we have to have clear definitions around the change manager's role, what's expected of CAB members, because it'll change from time to time who's going to be invited to that meeting based upon, you know, what's on the schedule of changes, and then, of course, what is the subset of the CAB that would be engaged whenever we have emergency changes, and what can we expect from you? What is your role going to be when we go through an emergency change? Now, the next step is to map your course. Now, we've done a lot of structuring here and putting things in place, the building blocks that are necessary for us to build upon, and now it's time to really begin to look at what a change management process looks like. And the only thing I can say is the easiest way to implement change management is to stay simple at the beginning. If you over-engineer it, you're going to get so in the details that you'll forget that you're actually managing changes and supposed to be preventing things from happening in the environment. So stick with this high-level macro process. You don't need to go into, this really in-depth thing until the need is there to manage changes at a more in-depth level. Start simple. We need to define the holistic approach. What do we do step by step? What has to occur? How do we close that loop? How do we ensure that we're measuring and monitoring this process, using the inputs and creating the outputs that are necessary for us to be successful within this process? So when we think about putting the definition behind this, it's how do we create the RFC? What are the roles that are involved in that? Who can create an RFC? How do we bring in the change proposals that we talked about? What is an appropriate form for that? How will people submit them? And how will we receive them from those submitters? Then we look at reviewing it. Come up with a standard, numbered 10 list of things that you want to look at for those RFCs. Is it complete? Has it been done before? Is it impractical? Do you have the level of authorization to actually request this? And so you have this quick checklist that you're running through consistently so that when a change is rejected and returned back to the initiator, you can give them that standard form and show them exactly what is missing as you've gone through the review of that, hopefully enabling them to provide the information that's necessary to resubmit or overcome whatever organizational issues have to be overcome. So we're working together, we're informing, but at the same time we're ensuring that before we go to the next step, we have all the information that we need prior to moving forward with a particular change. Now, the most important part of what change management does is minimize risk. There is no doubt that risk is something that is going to be punitive to the business and also to the IT organization. So when we assess a change, here's where if we can develop an approach of how we'll work together to assess those changes, will better enable us to consistently, time after time after time, manage the risk associated with that change. So we want to look at each one of these RFCs and consider what is the business trying to achieve and what's the impact of this change on the business operation. What is the customer service or SLA that might be impacted? What's the effect if we don't go forward of implementing that change? What resources will we need? And what is the impact of this particular change on our current schedule? We also want to look at, remember those things we already decided, the impact, the urgency, the risk, the benefits and costs. Those are things that because we put the structure in place, we're better able to consistently come up with an evaluation of these elements for us to move forward with that change. Prioritization is very important because it's where it goes in the queue, whether it's going in this week in the change window or if it has to wait for 2 more weeks, it really comes down to prioritization. And everybody will tell you it's important. It's got to go in now, but we can't usually do everything in 1 week. So we have to be able to prioritize what we're doing. That will help to also minimize the risk to the environment. Now, the 7 R's within change management are kind of this holistic approach, right? Who raised it? What was the reason? What are they expecting to get out of it, the return? What is the risk? What resources are required? Who's going to be responsible for the build, the test, and the implementation? And if we look at all of the changes that are on our schedule, what's the relationship between this RFC and all of the other changes? And this is that holistic approach. It enables us to assess that change consistently in order to help minimize the risk, rather than just kind of going around the room and saying, what do you think? Okay, yeah, it sounds good. We really want to come up with a simple way to assess the change and move forward so we can, with confidence, realize that we can manage the risk. Now, of course, then the next step is the authorization. Typically, the authorization, again, is defined earlier in one of those building blocks of who has the appropriate level of authority based upon the prioritization, the risk, and all of that, the cost that we already kind of assessed for this particular change. So now that entity will authorize the change, and then we have the group that will be in charge of coordinating the implementation. Because if we were to take every single RFC and say, okay, approved, implement, we would not be minimizing the disruption to the business. We would be bringing the business down time after time after time. So what we have to do is consolidate that change into a release. So maybe we have 10 or 15 changes that we know want to go in at one time. We put those together in a package, build, test, and implement that package, and then come back and look at the success of each one of those changes that were included in that package. So what we have to do at this point is coordinate that. We have to make certain that testing is being done, that we look at the results, that we have back-out plans and fallback plans. This is an important part because change management is still ultimately accountable for the success of the change, even though release is going through the work of doing the build, test, and implementation. Now, every change management process should be a closed loop because it doesn't matter if you start out simple or you've gone way overboard. You have to know what works and what doesn't work. And when we set up our authorization and our prioritization and our risk categorization and our change types, we did all this work in preparation for change management to be successful, but has it really been? And we have to go back and look at, did we manage the risk? Did we put this in the appropriate type? And did we categorize or prioritize it correctly? These are the important things that we have to go back and look at ourselves as an organization and say, did we do what we expected? Was it on time? Was it within budget? Are our stakeholders happy with the outcome? And did we have any unintended side effects, things that happen that weren't planned for? Now, we hope that these are positive things. More than likely, they're negative things, and it doesn't really create confidence for our business. What does create confidence is when we don't let it happen again, and we learn from this, and we go back and we improve our holistic approach to change management. Now, the next step is to invite all your closest neighbors to the party, and this is when we talk about the interfaces of change management. Change management, we started off by looking at what service transition is. It's a very complex set of processes that are sharing inputs and outputs with all these different levels of control and management and coordination. So the two key processes that have a tremendous relationship and dependency with change management are, first of all, release, right, taking those requests for change and packaging them and building them and putting them into the live environment, but also config. Config tracks all the infrastructure that we want to keep under control, and it provides information to change management that supports the assessment of the risk, and that's an important data trail that enables us to be more successful with change management. So if we can effectively document and keep the configuration management system up to date, then we can use that information within change management to be much more successful. But those two processes alone are not the only dependency here with change management. We talked about incident management, right? Incidents or problems that are produced from changes that have an unintended effect. We talked about organizational change and stakeholder change management. But there are a lot of things that are dependent in the design phase of the life cycle, like continuity and security, availability, and capacity, because this is where we are making the plan for the outcome, but now it's in the live environment. We have to go back and say, okay, here's how we engaged on that, and here's the gap between what we expected and what we actually got. So there's a lot of important information that comes out of that transition period where we learn so much about all the activities that we've done throughout the service life cycle and how effective they are. So change management can help to drive change in design and in transition to make us that much more successful in the future as we go through change. Now, one other very important one up here is the link to project management. If we don't pay attention to what's occurring within project management, then many times this will have those unintended impacts of a change going into the environment. We certainly don't want to have the business going through some major sales initiative, and the same weekend that they launch it, we decide to go through an upgrade with Salesforce, right? We don't want the timing of changes to be impactful on major initiatives going on in the business. So that's kind of a connection to make certain that we're paying attention to projects that are going on in the environment that produce change, but also that the changes that we have aren't negatively impacting the projects that we might be running within the organization. So the last thing is really, how do we put all of this together? I talked about a lot of things about what creates a holistic approach. And remember when I said the scope, start with the operational changes. There's a lot of change that's going on in the operational environment that we can get control over. There are the changes that are coming in from the operational environment. These are putting in new systems, upgrading hardware or software or applications, the changing of people and moving around of roles and responsibilities. These are things that need to be tracked. So they're triggers. If we can make the connections with the groups that are doing these types of changes, we've gone a long way to help manage them. Then we need to be able to understand that these operational staff have the subject matter expertise that is required to assess those changes. They're the ones that know how the infrastructure works and how these systems interact with one another. They have to be involved in those assessments to make certain that we can manage the risk. The operational environment is also where we measure how successful we're going to be with change. So we have three very important ways and quick wins just within the operational environment: the triggers, the assessment, and measurement, where we can make a difference with change management very quickly. Then there's the day-to-day operations. There's how do we keep the services up and running. It's the maintenance of the environment, backups, and the fine-tuning that we do to keep things balanced in the infrastructure. This is what produces a lot of those RFCs. And it's important for us to understand that that volume is where we can have some of this unintended effect if we're not paying attention to this. One of the biggest differences we can make here in the operational environment is to begin documenting these types of changes. These are ripe for change models, these predefined steps and sequences with roles and responsibilities that enable us to manage them quickly, to have the appropriate amount of control, and then we can see the impact very quickly in the operational environment of minimizing the disruption because we have these things well documented and well under control. Now, a couple things to think about when implementing change management. Generally, try to prepare a timeline of 3 to 6 months. All that work up front that I talked about the building blocks to creating the holistic approach, is really important to do. You can't skip. The things that I put in here are what you have to have. So that planning time is to help prepare you to get the organization to begin changing the way that they view change management and begin working together. Also, don't forget to train. We need to make certain that even though we had our key decision makers involved and we got management commitment to what we want to do, that doesn't mean that everybody out there that produces changes or builds or tests understands what it is that we've decided. So we have to go out and help people to understand the three types: the categorization, the prioritization, the process. What is a standard change? What are the authorization levels? That is incredibly important for us to launch with people that know what change management is. It will help us with process compliance, with measuring, and will also help us with continuous improvement. Don't try to implement the process without the training. It's a very important part of that. And we really need an integrated approach. So whether those other processes exist today isn't as important as it is to integrate change management across the different functional groups that we have within the IT organization, because those are the people that, even if they're not in scope today, will be in scope in the future. So we want to begin building awareness across the organization. It's really about building relationships as the organization matures and continuing to evolve change management to meet the business needs. Now, there's always going to be challenges with change management. The number one thing that we always have is, I didn't have to do it this way and we were doing just fine. So people will not follow the process. And this could be very detrimental, especially at the early stages, if this person or people are vocal and, this is just the flavor of the day, I'm not going to do it. We have to have measurement in place to ensure that people are following the process, because the unauthorized changes are what we're trying to prevent, and that's what the policy up front. We have to agree that there will not be unauthorized or undocumented changes is beginning to set the precedence with everybody. Look, we need to follow the process. We don't want to put untested changes in there. That's the immediate way for us to get in trouble. And when we have the pressure, do it now, we tend to skip testing. And that's what we can't do, because as soon as we do that, we introduce risk. Not having a backout plan. Sometimes you say, well, we just have to go forward. Well, okay, yes, but what's our backout plan? It could be all hands on deck, right? It could be let's have an effective response in the case that it does cause some sort of an outage where we're all working together. But we have to have something in place in case there should be an unintended effect. Not having the data on the infrastructure and the configuration management system, getting the pressure from the business, not getting in business involved, these can all be challenges that you'll face as you go down this path. But inappropriate or incorrect change types or models, I'm hoping that we prevent that by doing the work up front to get consensus on that. And then the last challenge there, if you're the person driving this, make certain you have the right level of authority to really create change. If you don't, then you better have a really powerful group behind you that you've got commitment from, because you really need the right level of authority to make change management stick in an organization. All right, so how can I help you with this? Let me take a look at the questions that we have that are coming up. How can you identify unauthorized changes? I'll tell you, this is really where that relationship with configuration management comes into play, because it gives us this ability to see where things have been added to the environment that are not in the configuration management system. Another key place, and again, they'll find out through auditing the environment and you know, going out and verifying portions of the infrastructure, and when they see things are being installed, they go follow it up and find out who did it. But one of the key places that we see a lot of this would be at the service desk. When we call the customer and we ask them, what's the tag number on the computer that you're using, and it doesn't match, or they're not in the office location that it says that they're supposed to be in, that someone's moving stuff around and doing things that isn't being documented. So that would be ongoing verifying where changes are happening in the environment. The last thing that we want to do is find out about the unauthorized changes, because incidents occurred. That's obviously, it's already created an impact, and that's not going to be beneficial. What are your thoughts about latent changes? I'm not sure what you mean by latent changes. If you follow up with another question, define what you mean by latent, and then I'll answer that. I'm not sure if you mean changes that don't go through the window that have to be pushed off, but give me what you mean by latent. Let me go to another question. You mentioned both the process aspect and the organizational aspect of implementing change. Could you expand on the support required in order to implement a change process, specifically senior management backing or change champions? Well, part of the building blocks is really defining roles and responsibilities. And so part of the roles and responsibilities are going to be more than just the change manager, the CAB, and the ECAB, right? It's going to be the extended community that have to support that. It starts with executive commitment, because guess what? If you do find one of those unauthorized changes and you want to go with that person and work with them to help them understand why this is unacceptable behavior, if they blow you off, you have to have that escalation point that's going to support you going forward, that yes, this is the way that we're doing business today, and guess what? If you don't do this, then we're going to see, you know, there's some sort of a repercussions to that being mandated by senior management. So that's important. But a lot of times, if we can just get a couple people that know and understand the value of what we're trying to achieve through peer pressure and through measuring and reporting and communicating that to the broader audience, we're really likely to get better commitment across the board. Because I don't know about you, but if somebody else is doing it and they're getting great results and I've got mediocre results, just that alone, the gap between them doing better than me, I'm going to want to begin to adopt things that are going to make me more successful. So that's what those change champions help to bring to the organization. Next question. How do you build the executive commitment to back a change? That's a challenging one, but it's got to start at the very beginning. That was the beginning where I talked about building your case for change management and getting people to understand what is the need for change. All you got to do is look at the amount of incidents that are produced as a result of changes that had an unintended impact, and then relate that to downtime, and relate that to salaries, and relate that to full-time employees, and the picture becomes very clear to senior management very quickly of what we're doing and the impact that it's having on the business when these services go down. And so there's nothing like creating that financial impact of change to help get senior executives to commit to, you know, adopting change management moving forward. Next question. What is an emergency change? Something to repair, break, or fix, or a change that occurs without authorized change? No. An emergency change is a change that cannot wait till the next change window. So if we allow changes to go through on the first Thursday of the month and the fourth Thursday of the month, then those are our two change windows. And if we have something that's right now down and it's impacting the business and it's equated to real money very quickly, we can't wait till those two Thursday windows. It's got to go in now. That's the definition of an emergency change. Otherwise, if it can wait, then we can plan it and go through our formal change life cycle and then put it through in the next change window as a normal change. What do you think lead time should be defined as, and who do you think escalation should go to if someone cannot follow the lead time? Curiously, that's the policy. That goes back to what is an appropriate time frame that we need in order to process a change. Now, the policy is a guideline. There are always going to be things that will come up that we know, but based on the risk prioritization and the categorization and prioritization, we now know that, okay, we have this traditional lead time that we have. This one's going to have to come in despite that we have that lead time because of that prioritization. So you could probably set up a policy that says, here's the lead time. Only those items that are considered to be emergency or high risk, high priority might come in quicker than that because of that assessment. So you can create the policy that will help you to manage those more effectively. And that's where I try to create the policy first and let the policy help to drive the behaviors instead of being more punitive in nature. But then you've always got to follow it up with measurement and reporting to show who's abusing the process, because that costs the organization money, and it could likely cause us to focus on things that aren't directly related to the value that the business is expecting. Well, folks, that's all we have time for today. I very much appreciate all of you attending, and I wish I could have gotten to the rest of the questions. But again, my name is Julie Moore. You can connect with me, any social media that you have. There's my email address, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, you name it, it's up there. Or feel free to contact me via the telephone. It's been wonderful having you here today, and good luck with your change management initiative. Have a great afternoon. Bye now.